Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacob Frey, and I'm sitting here with our Chief of Police, Brian O'Hara. And we wanted to make sure to interview first, before anyone else, following the press conference with our Black media outlets here in the city. And it's been kind of a tradition after seismic events occur in the city that we go to you all first and we answer any questions that you have. And you've done a tremendous job at making sure that you're relaying and disseminating a boatload of really important information, but also at times pretty complex details. And so we really appreciate your time and we thank you for your participation on here. And with that, we'll turn it over to you. I have a feeling that we'll probably get into the meat of this very shortly. Chief, anything you want to add before we jump right in?
No, just, I know everybody has been waiting a long time for this day to come. And as difficult as it is, just thankful that we are finally here, so we can begin the process of healing and trying to make progress. So,
That's right.
Thank you.
That's right.
Mr. Mayor, I'd love you to first give the background, the backstory, what led us started George Floyd's murder and how we got here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. McFarland, for the question, really laying up the backdrop of how we got here and where we're going. So the impetus for the investigation was the murder of George Floyd 3 years ago. While that was the impetus, this did not have one exclusive causal connection. And what I mean by that is we aren't just talking about the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. We are talking about a necessary culture shift that is long overdue, that has needed to be in place for years and generations. Over the following 3 years, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, announced that they would be conducting a patterns and practice investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. And they, from the very beginning, had our full cooperation. The people at the DOJ are experts. They're some of the top lawyers. They did a deep investigation that was thorough, that was thoughtful, and that tackled the specificity of the issues that we need to be focusing on now. And they delivered the conclusions of their pattern and practice investigation this morning. The primary four areas that they were focusing on were use of force, discrimination, ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act violations. And then the fourth one is First Amendment. So those are the four general areas, and certainly there is a lot of information in each one of those. And I haven't even read the full report yet myself, and so if to the extent that I'm not able to answer some of the questions specifically, that is the primary reason why. We are going to be digging into this report in full very soon. Of course, we've been briefed on it already. But the conclusion here is that we want to partner to get the change that we need. We want a partner in the DOJ to have deep-seated change throughout our department, not just in the way of a policy on paper, but something that the community feels, because that is what true success is going to look like. Success is not relegated to the signature by a judge at the end of a consent decree process, or some confirmation that we have met or have not met compliance standards. Success looks like people on the street in our city feeling safe and even safer when they interact with our police. That is where we want to get. We've done a lot of work. There is a tremendous amount of work and progress that is underway, and we recognize that there is a whole lot of work and progress left to take place. And so we're wholeheartedly in this mission, and we're not going to quit until every person in this city feels safe.
The extent to which the details of these 4 points were laid out, it seems like there's nothing short of dismantling the department and starting from the ground up. Will it go that far, or what does it look like in rebuilding the trust, not only within the ranks, but within the community?
The work is wholesale. This is making sure that we don't just have the policy change written on paper. And by the way, we've authored a ton of policy changes. It's making sure that officers understand what is expected of them through that policy change, that they're trained in on how to respond to that policy change, and then ultimately that they're held accountable if they don't live up to the standards that are met through that policy change. And having that shift of culture and of policy embedded in the department is the part that we're working on the most right now. Again, we've done a ton of policy changes. We need to institute it throughout the department in all of the interactions so that people feel it on the street.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Pan, on assignment with the Sox Recorder. I've got a couple questions for you two today. So one question, this comes from a reader. I am wondering, given the report said after May 25th, 2020, police officers stopped collecting race data on who they were stopping because there was a trend that showed that they were stopping Black and Native Americans more often than they were stopping white people. So what do you two plan to do so that they don't retaliate in light of these findings from the article, as they have been demonstrated to show in the past? Are you going to fire anyone who has been caught in this report doing these behaviors that violate federal law?
That's something that we need to fix in the immediacy here, to make sure that. I apologize. I believe Al might have just. There we go. It's something we need to fix in the immediacy, to make sure that we're getting accurate data, and that officers are accurately reflecting whatever their perception is when they provide that information. And so that's one of the issues that I too was concerned about. We need to be looking into that in the immediacy.
I mean, some of these things, quite frankly, particularly around data collection, are very common problems in police departments. They become highlighted with the very few police departments that are subjected to this level of scrutiny. I just learned about this issue with data collection and race during stops. And when I learned about it, I learned that one of the options officers have here is to select that the race is unknown. That's a part of the standard reporting process. So it sounds like that option being available is what was creating this discrepancy, which, as the mayor mentioned, the whole purpose of collecting data around race, particularly in enforcement data, is not to get to some sense of certainty as to what exactly a person's race was. The purpose is to have the officer's perception. So if an officer can see someone on a stop, then that perception must be reported, and unknown should not be an option. So that would be a simple fix, is to correct that as being an option.
Let me talk about you. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just hold on. I wanted to, since David has his hand up, I want to let him go first before. Yeah, I got more questions, but I want to make sure we all have our chance, because I do tend to ask a lot of questions. So.
Hey, thank you. I was struck by some of the reporting about, I guess, what would be viewed more as kind of the casual racism that would take place among the officers, everything from comments made to people in their custody to the Christmas tree incident at the 4th Precinct. And I wonder is there anything, it's one thing to create policy around custody, how you take someone into custody, but how do you address that casual racism that, to me, is a sign of something much deeper than just a joke?
Well, it's a sign of the reality of what exists in policing. There are issues of racism and bias in policing, just as there are in the criminal justice system, larger, just as there are in the city of Minneapolis and in society as a whole. That's just the reality of life. But what we have to do is take advantage of, for example, the technology that we have with body-worn cameras, ensuring that every interaction that an officer has, particularly during an enforcement action and a call for service, is recorded, and putting processes in place to ensure that there is routine review of those, and to hold officers accountable when anything from some sort of microaggression to occurs to something that would be outwardly clearly a violation of policy. So I mean, these things are kind of cultural issues to some extent. I think just in general, what is most common with police officers in the United States is more or less issues of disrespect and those types of things that come across very easily, and it can be a number of ways. It could be just sort of an officer's demeanor, their attitude, how they talk to people, how they engage with people. And there are ways to set very clear parameters and instructions on how you will handle a stop, for example. And then there are ways to ensure that we hold supervisors accountable for reviewing them and holding their officers accountable, and then having a check on the supervisors. So this is a unique situation in that when we have these types of agreements, that there's an independent federal monitor, somebody who works on behalf of the court, that can then check our processes and provide an independent accounting to the community of whether or not we are meeting those goals and those standards of addressing these things. But there absolutely are concrete things that we can do, processes that we can put in place that we will be able to prove and report to community how our progress is towards meeting these goals.
I would this is Al McFarland again. I'd love for both of you to describe this moment.
Two questions going on at the same time.
Which one?
Sorry. I'm sorry.
No, I was actually going off of.
Three.
We got a three.
Now we have three
Hang on a
questions.
second. Why don't we
Okay.
we'll call on you and then we'll go.
Yeah, there we go.
I see your hands are up, but I think
So I'll start with Al, and then I'll go to David, and then
Henry.
I'm sorry, Henry. What's the name?
I go by my Chinese name Jia Hong nowadays.
Jia Hong.
Jia Hong. You almost got it.
Thank you.
So the Jia rhymes with cat, and the Hong is basically like cat home, essentially.
Jia Hong.
So,
Jia Hong.
yeah, you got it.
Thank you. My
Okay.
apologies.
And we can just keep going in that order if it makes sense. We kind of know when our turn is. That works for me. So listen, I wanted to get a sense of how you are both feeling and assessing this moment. I think it's a big deal what happened today. It's important for our community. It's important as part of the healing process around and following the death and murder of George Floyd. But as you said, and as Attorney General Merrick Garland said this morning, this involved not only our community, but the nation, and in many ways, the world. You both were passionate about the opportunity in this situation. And I'd love to hear you stretch out on what it means now, because the horror has happened. What we're all working towards is eliminating the prospect of horror in anybody's life, the officer's life, the citizen's life, the community's life. But there's a vision you've announced today about what can happen that reflects a different attitude about policing and accountability. Would you go into that?
I'll start and then you can take over, Chief. So we recognize that the eyes of the world are on Minneapolis, and we want to make sure that we are an example that we are setting for others to follow. And you asked how I'm feeling. I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. I believe that we've got the right people in the right seats, including, of course, Chief O'Hara, that not only have the experience and expertise in consent decrees and making deep-seated change, but also have the kind of integrity and the work ethic to get the job done. And I do believe that officers in our department are also committed to being that change. And so I am optimistic. Now, change is tough. Change is painful. There are hurdles that are in place that we're going to need to blow right through in some cases. And we're also going in very clear-eyed about the difficulty in making some of these changes a reality. And I'll just give you one example. David, just earlier, you mentioned the Christmas tree over at the 4th Precinct.
Yeah.
If you recall, very shortly after that incident, very shortly after we became aware of that incident, I said something to the extent of the officers should be fired. And they were. The decision was made, they were fired, the decision was then grieved, it went up to arbitration, and we lost. The decision we had made to terminate was overturned. And so there are things that are very much in our bailiwick at the city, and those were highlighted extensively within the DOJ report. There are also things like, for instance, the police union contract and like state law that are outside of the things that we're able at least to do unilaterally. And so this is why it really requires a lot of us working together. Because if you make one change over here, but you still have the blockade in place, you won't realize the full benefit. And so that's what we're working towards right now. But to your underlying question, Al, I'm hopeful. I am feeling the weight of the work that is having to take place and we need to do. But I'm optimistic we can make the change.
Just to add to what the mayor said, I'm the outsider here. So unlike folks who have been here for decades or who sort of grew up in the police department here, I can come in and see things that appear different to me from what I had been used to in my previous experience. One thing I can tell you for sure is I am very surprised in a really good way. We have enormous challenges here, but it's been almost overwhelming. How welcoming people in community have been, and just the strong desire for progress that is virtually universal here among our police officers, the police officers who remain working for the city, as well as people from communities all around the town. So there is almost a universal desire for progress. People may not agree on how exactly that progress or change might happen, but I think there's the only way forward really is to try and rebuild bridges and to try and build trust and earn trust in places where maybe it hasn't existed ever before. And this really is an opportunity for the police department to reach out and do that. But at the same time, it is uniquely challenging in that the number of sworn members of the police department is lower than it had been in decades. And at the same time, we have very real challenges around crime and violence. In some cases, higher than had been in many years. So the police officers who remain have been through a lot and are incredibly traumatized, just like so many of our residents here. And really we have really serious challenges in addressing crime and violence, but it's also an opportunity to try and connect and earn people's trust so that we can address those challenges in a way that is sustainable over time.
Freddie, go for it.
What type of impact do you believe that the release today from Merrick Garland will have on the ranks itself as you're trying to increase those numbers? Is there a both-end approach to this, Chief?
It is absolutely a both-end approach. Unfortunately, for many of our officers, they really have been through a lot. So many of their coworkers have left. Hundreds have left. Some of them have left policing completely. Some have taken pensions. Some have gone to other law enforcement agencies, quite frankly, to do an easier job, in some cases for more money. Many of the officers that are left here, have very real open wounds, just like folks in community. So they're still dealing with the trauma and the things that they have experienced here. And I think a lot of them feel like many times they are painted with a broad brush. Many times they are not given a chance from folks. And I think Many times they feel like they have been unfairly maligned personally. Like they think that some of these comments they take very personally, as if people are saying it's them personally. So that's difficult for them to deal with, just like all of this stuff is difficult for our residents to deal with. So I do think it's an opportunity again to as we engage and try and figure this thing out together, to use it as an opportunity, use that common trauma as an opportunity to have communication and develop some bonds and level of understanding that have not existed before.
If I can quickly follow up. So what are you saying to Mr. and Mrs. Jones who won't call the police when there's an issue because they're concerned that they might become the victim from a police interaction? What can you say, if anything, to allay some of these concerns of particularly those in North Minneapolis who are concerned about that police interaction, even in the face of this new discovery and release by Merrick Garland today?
That's terrible, and that's very disturbing, because we know, our residents who are most affected by serious crime and violence, who are afraid to allow their kid to walk to the corner store, are nervous that a bullet might come through the window. Those are the same residents that oftentimes are most affected by policing itself. And so people should know that we are very serious and very committed about trying to earn their trust and to get this right. We're not here to just talk about this stuff and move on. This is real. We're going to put in the time. We're going to put in the work. And any instance, where an officer is disrespectful or does not handle something appropriately will absolutely be dealt with.
Jihan, and then David.
Okay.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, I was on mute, but yes, thank you. So wanted to follow up. So we were talking about the cultural aspect of Minneapolis Police Department. And one thing I've noticed is that the culture of the police department is kind of endemic to Minnesota Nice. And it seems like there's this aspect of like, people want things to change, but there's never often work that is actually done to make that change. And I'm wondering if either of you have figured out how to overcome Minnesota Nice, either in like other aspects of your professional life or with regard to the Minneapolis Police Department. How are you able to develop policy that is like followed by the officers, socially just, instead of like just officers who are like enthusiastic about policy changes, but don't necessarily follow them because they're just giving out a facade, for example?
Well, I'm not very Minnesota nice, I guess. I'm not from here. I think me being regular at times is perceived almost as aggressive in some cases. But I can tell you honestly, I think our cops, by and large, are just looking for direction at this point. They want to know, they've heard a lot of these things so many times, and they want to have clear direction. They want to be able to not just hear that a policy comes out, but they want to be able to have, good reality-based training, some time to understand these things, and really just some support, some better support in trying to figure this stuff out. And I think, it does go hand in hand with trying to rebuild the police department and have more officers available, because officer training, officer wellness, their health, their well-being, that all plays a part in how we show up for community. So I think all these issues are related, and I do think there is a really strong desire to just have clear direction and the support that's needed to go with that to try and move forward.
And then also, I'm wondering, so Mayor Frey, a lot of people have said that you have sole authority over what goes on with the police department. It seems like a lot of people wish that you could just take a magic wand and just like change the police department overnight. Why is that not possible? Why can't you just implement like steady changes over 24 hours? Like, what implications might that have on the police department if you were able to do that?
Jihong, that's an excellent question. Not a day goes by that I don't wish that we did have that sort of magic wand where we could wave it and then suddenly everything changes. I get questions from people oftentimes that says, why don't you do X or Y or Z? And the vast majority of the time, we've tried to do X or Y or Z, and there's either a legal reason that we can't, or there's an extended process that we have to go through in order to make the change that is being advocated for. Following the murder of George Floyd, we were rushing in a good, urgent way to make policy changes. This is doing the other side of that, which is at least as important as the policy change. This is making sure that all of the other parts that institute cultural shift happen along with that change on the paper. And yeah, change does take time. I mentioned this during the press conference. We're not talking about days or months, we're talking about years. And I need to be very upfront with everyone on this right off the bat. If we do everything perfectly, if we execute the changes that need to be made perfectly, we're still talking about years. And given that the very human nature of city government, the human nature of police officers themselves, we're not going to do everything perfectly. That's just the reality of the situation that we're in. But I'll tell you, there is a collective desire to change. There is a collective desire, both among those that are already working for the city and those that would come in, both sworn and non, to be the change that we're talking about.
And I got to add to it to what the mayor is saying. The reality is these changes require significant levels of investment.
Yes.
The reason why these things just don't happen unto themselves in cities across the country where these issues are real. This isn't just Minneapolis and the handful of places that are under consent decrees. This is a problem with policing in general, all over the country. So reason why this stuff doesn't happen is one, individual incidents may be visible, but all the stuff underneath, the systems, the processes that are lacking that create these opportunities for things to happen, that's not necessarily visible. So that's why, being able to have the Department of Justice to come in and do such a deep dive is so helpful. But to get to some of the root of these issues, but really going forward and trying to fix this stuff, not only does it take years, but it takes millions of dollars. Right. So that's why, we're thankful that we have this, because the city, frankly, will have no choice if we want to get and eventually come into compliance with these agreements, is to make the investments that are needed to remedy the situation.
David.
I was going to ask a two-part question. One is there something about a consent decree that can overcome some of the obstacles that you spoke of, Mayor Frey, with the union contract and being able to discipline officers as you see fit? And secondly, is there an example, Chief, in New Jersey that really brought police and community together that you're proud of, that you think can work here?
So a couple parts to your question here. First, the consent decree, once signed and entered, doesn't supersede existing contracts, but it can be a very helpful tool to emphasize the need for change in them. It can be helpful to emphasize the need for change in a collective bargaining agreement, which both sides have to agree to. It's not about just negotiating harder. We literally need an agreement from both sides. And then the second piece is state law. And like I said, there are aspects of the report that deal directly with state law. And so what this helps us to do is delineate between the things that are within our authority, which we need to work on, the things that are outside of our authority, which we can only indirectly influence, and then the work that needs to happen to get us to progress. I also like the fact that this having a consent decree in place with experts, it takes a lot of politics out of the equation. It puts a flag in the ground and it says, we're going to get here as a community. We're going to get this particular policy change done. We're going to make sure that officers are trained in on it. We're going to make sure that they're held accountable to it. The politics are gone. There doesn't need to be an extended debate as to whether we need an early intervention system. We need an early intervention system. There doesn't need to be an extended debate about how or what we're going to spend on. We have to. A lot of the work of change, it costs money. And so this concept where you pull all the money away and then somehow that in and of itself influences the change, it's dead wrong. These consent decrees and the change that we want to see, yes, is expensive, not because we want it to be, but because we need personnel to do the work. We need compliance officers to check the work. We need people to make sure that this is happening, not just on the surface level, but deep-seated change throughout the department, which is what we're talking about here. So is this going to be expensive? I'll tell people transparently, the answer is yes.
And just a time check here, we can maybe give each person one more question.
I'll start with that.
Sure. Okay, great. Gentlemen, thank you both, Mayor Frey and Chief O'Hara. Sort of a big question. You can answer any part or any direction you want to take it. Specifically, you mentioned hurdles and roadblocks that lie ahead. One that I think exists is qualified immunity. And that's a small question, but core to the question of the negotiation between the department and the union. So how do you see navigating to a system and process that fosters accountability, that removes what some people believe is an immunity and a go card for an officer that wants to be a rogue and do whatever he wants to do or she wants to do because there's no consequence for bad acting? So that's the first question. And the last part is, what about the culture? Chief, you came out of Newark, and that community has gone through a consent decree. I'd like to hear about what is different through that process.
Yeah.
But we're here in 2023, and the question of the MAGA right is looming large in everybody's mind. What happened in January and the emergence of this voice that is considered conservative, how does that play into the internal mindset of both the officers and a certain element of our community that seem to want what I call repression and oppression as the symbol of law and order versus an inclusive, open, inviting, and educating relationship between and among all of us for common and greater good? Big question.
Okay. So try and hit all of that. In regard to qualified immunity, first off, I think some things that get forgotten with that. Qualified immunity applies to more than just police. It applies to people who act on behalf of government. Mm-hmm. So I think first off, if there were reforms to qualified immunity, it should apply to all government actors across the board. I think in general with qualified immunity, any officer whose actions are criminal, they need to be held criminally accountable. That's number one. They need to be charged in court and face a jury like anyone else for committing a crime. So that should be handled immediately on the criminal side before we even get to something on the civil side. But I do think for officers who are objectively reasonable and that are taking actions in good faith, that they should have some form of qualified immunity available to protect them, because eliminating that completely would present a huge amount of challenges that would make, I just think, the situation that much more difficult. But what people need to understand is the way the courts interpret qualified immunity today is problematic. It is not as easy as saying that an officer who acted objectively reasonable, would be granted it. I think the way the courts interpreted it does provide cover in situations where it shouldn't. And that's something that our elected officials should look at and should be willing to make some reforms. But I think it's something that should apply to everyone across the board. I think in Newark, Newark is a different city. It's a majority Black community. It's a community with a lot more serious challenges around crime, socioeconomics, and all these types of things. But it is a place, similarly, that had very real problems with police and community interactions with people who had felt that they had frustrating and bad relations with police for decades. And you could talk to a lot of those people today and ask them about this. And I think, universally, people who have been there for decades, people who have been protesting police would tell you, yeah, today things are different. And that's just a sign that over a couple of years, if you are intentional about this, if you have a community that's willing to work with you and to be a part of the process, and if you have people from the police department who are willing to engage, that it really is possible to make change real. And that realness is just different from anything that a court or a monitor could say. If it's something that people on the street feel, and they can tell you, yeah, it's different today than it had been, 5-10 years ago, then that's what we're really going at, as opposed to, getting some sort of statistics that a judge would sign off on.
Thank you.
Freddie.
Thank you, and thank you, Al, for asking the question about the police union. I was wondering about negotiations with that body, but as the nation and the world is watching and digesting today's announcement from the top legal mind, Merrick Garland, it appears to me, Your Honor, that this is not as much as a gut punch to you as it seems it could have been on its face, considering all the work that has gone into correcting behavior to this point, i.e. the person who's sitting to your left and Cedric Alexander, and then putting an attorney inside to work alongside the police department.
I think it'd be egotistical to think that this is all about me. I'm the mayor of the city, and so I have a responsibility here. And so it's on us. It's on me as an executive to make the necessary changes. And look, I embrace that responsibility. I feel the weight of it every single day. This is it's a tough job, and inevitably, no matter what you do, you get hit from all different sides. But it's a job where you can make a whole lot of progress, and that's why I'm optimistic about it. And I said this at the time that George Floyd was murdered. It's also not just about policing. There are a host of inequities that have been instilled in our city and in our nation over decades and generations. There's 300 years worth of injustices that we're talking about here. And it's everything from a lack of fair housing, a lack of fair employment opportunities. It's redlining, restrictive covenants that run with the land, intentional segregation that has separated out communities from some of their most vital assets. And yes, it's the judicial system and law enforcement also. And so to just look at this through one narrow lens of correction will not see a corrective action in full. And that's why we're tackling this, not just from a policing standpoint, which is critical, but from a housing, from an economic inclusion standpoint, from an environmental justice standpoint as well. That's where a lot of the work happens.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, I'll go to Jihung and then to David.
Sounds good. So one more question that I have, this is coming up from some of the readers. With regard to the officers who were identified in the report committing misconduct, what's going to happen with those officers? Are they under investigation? Are they going to be fired? What is going to happen to those officers?
Well, I haven't personally gone through the whole report yet. I have heard from people who are scanning it that at least some of these instances that have been reported officers were terminated or they have since separated from the agency. So I don't know specifics, again, because I haven't been afforded the opportunity to go through this thing, but that's definitely something that we will be doing. And from everything that I've heard, a lot of the examples that were given were officers who were either disciplined and terminated or had otherwise separated from the department since.
Thank you.
David.
A question again about numbers. My understanding in Newark, because there's always been this debate about how many police officers we really need in the city. And my understanding from Newark is it actually took more officers to create, a trusting environment to bring, safety to communities. And I just wonder where we're at in terms of, building those numbers up, but then also what are you building towards, like more community policing, officers on patrol, peacekeeping officers. I mean, what does that look like, I guess, is my question.
So when I became a Newark police officer, Newark has, I don't know, about 311,000 residents, something like that. It's a smaller city by about 100,000 or so. And when I became a Newark police officer, we had 1,500 police officers. It, varied over the years, but when we did have the DOJ investigation and then a consent decree, one of the requirements that is in the consent decree today for Newark is staffing. Because when they did the investigation, they found that what happens is if you don't have enough police officers for the demand, which is a situation that we're in right now, a lot of times what can happen is we have to triage things. So as officers leave a department as it gets smaller, and at the same time very serious crime is rising, you need manpower and people to investigate those things, to try and have some sense of justice for victims in those cases. And you also have the demand that you need to continue to respond to. So unfortunately, a lot of times what happens in police departments as they shrink is the other things that we should be doing are not able to get done. So we're actually at a time right now where we need to be doing and engaging and doing more community engagement, more community policing in ways that we haven't been before. But with the challenges of staffing, we're just not physically able to be present in as many places as we should be. And that is just important, if not more important, than having enough resources that are available to ensure justice for victims and to be able to respond to emergencies and so on. So I am hopeful. I actually suggested it to the justice officials today that be considered, that there be some sort of guidance, some sort of evaluation to give the city a better sense of, because that's a question that's come up many times here from residents and people as they think through these things. Like, yes, we need to do more, for example, with behavioral health emergencies and finding other ways to address that outside of police. But once we do all that, taking into account the demand for 911 that requires police response, the demand for investigations that must be done by law enforcement, what is the numbers that we should have so that we can have officers that have enough time to do non-law enforcement things in community? There's no way we're going to change the perception against police in some neighborhoods where kids grow up, with a very, very negative sense and a very, very negative perception of police. We're not going to change, people's perception, especially young people, if the only time they see us, we're there to do something negative. We're there to stop somebody. We're there to arrest someone on a domestic violence call. We're not going to change this thing. So that's why it's so important. We need to be able to have enough officers that we're able to handle the emergencies and the investigations that we have to be able to. One of the most important things we need to be doing is having our regular officers, not some special group of people that they just do the engagement or whatever. Our regular street cops should have enough time to do some meaningful engagement each day.
Well said, Chief.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I've actually got to get the chief going to his next meeting in a second here. But if you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and email us. I think you've got the email of our comms crew in case you have any additional thoughts or questions. We would be happy to the extent we can answer them. And I appreciate all of your willingness to gather in such short order. You've done it before. I know you do it again. You do this to make sure that the people in your communities both have a voice and hear from us, and we appreciate both.
Thanks for creating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the
Yeah.
time.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you
us.
all.
Thank you. Peter. Well, there was a great opportunity to get a firsthand story to our audience directly from Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey and from the Chief of Police, Chief O'Hara. They both were speaking earlier this morning, along with the U.S. Attorney General and the Attorney General for Minnesota and others about the Justice Department's report on policy and practice findings, I would say, against and in the Minneapolis Police Department. But they also left both this morning and tonight outlining, detailing an optimism, a plan for restoration of trust, for positive engagement between the police department and the residents of Minneapolis, and a commitment to create a community in which every resident of the city of Minneapolis felt he had a positive and productive interaction with members of law enforcement. Well, this has been a special edition of The Conversation with Al McFarland. We'll be back again Monday. Have a great weekend. Monday's Juneteenth. We'll be doing a Juneteenth program. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye.